Welcome to In Conversation with Brad Wendes, episode 21, just me again this week. And you may have noticed that I had a week off last week. And to be honest, I've been posting daily uploads for 20 weeks now. And I needed a break. Simple as that. We've got loads on at work. I've got lots going on in preparation for the summer. I have a toddler and I need a bit of time off. And I was really nervous about just, not posting because I've got this self-imposed deadline that 1 p.m. GMT every single Friday. I've got to put out a long form video that has to be interesting, engaging. It has to be an interview. And now I've got 200 subscribers. So thank you all very much. I feel a bit of an obligation to give you guys some content. But it was getting a bit much and I had a week off and it got to Friday and I'm like, oh man, I haven't posted anything this week. And, there's going to be a couple of days where there's no shorts go out because I haven't scheduled anything. And you know what? Friday came around, Friday went, the world didn't end. So I do appreciate your patience, but I just need a bit of time to get things together. And I've got some interviews scheduled. I'm going to be filming at Cube Studios tomorrow, which is the podcast studio I spoke about a few weeks ago. I'm going to be over there with Will Wayland, who's a strength and conditioning coach. Really, really interesting guy. There's a few things I think we'll talk about, but you never know with these things. Claire from GK's Graphics. She's a small business owner who makes car graphics. She's into kind of car modification and has a unit nearby. And she's got a really interesting story about being a female in that space and setting up on her own. So really, really interesting. I've got Zoe, who's going to be talking about being a professional dancer. She's coming on in a few weeks. And I've also spoken to two Toms. I've got Tom Taylor and Tom Booth-Woodger, who couldn't be more different. I've got a parkour strength and conditioning guy and a photographer who creates books, which are just beautiful. And they've got a new one launching. So he's going to come and talk about that. But all in all, daily uploads for 20 weeks. I'm quite proud of that as an achievement. And you know what? I can have a week off and we can start season 2 of In Conversation with Brad Wendes now. And guys, I'm always open for some feedback. If you do think something's interesting, if you do like it, let me know. If you don't like it, if you don't think it's interesting, let me know and I'll change things. Because at the end of the day, while I'm making this for myself for a bit of fun, it's more fun if more people watch it. So let me know what you want to see and give some feedback on these interviews as well. So this week's been the big one, hasn't it? General election was on Thursday, the 4th of July, 2024. As expected, Labour won a majority of seats. But what does that even mean? What does that really mean? What's the mandate from the people here? And looking at the stats, it's been quite an interesting one. Labour won a landslide majority in 1997. I wasn't old enough to vote then. And in 2001, they won again. I think they even got a bigger vote share in 2001, which was the first year I was able to vote. So do your math if you like. I was actually working in the States at that point, so I don't recall voting. Even the first year I was eligible to vote, I don't think I voted because I was out of the country and I was 18 and had far more things to worry about. So just having a look at these stats here on the election this year. So Labour won 411 seats, which is up 209. They got 209 more seats this time than they did in 2019. Now, what's interesting about the British electoral system is the way that we manage things with what we call first past the post. And that is we have 650 constituencies. Each constituency has just over 73,000 eligible voters or registered voters. So every constituency, although some are massive in terms of geography and some are very small, like inner city constituencies are quite small, whereas one near me is enormous because it's mostly rural. It's based on the number of registered voters in that space. So each constituency, each of the 650 constituencies should represent roughly the same number of people. It's fair to say over the years, there's been an amount of gerrymandering done. So some of these constituencies are very strange shapes or occupy lots of different towns with very different needs that might only have one member of parliament. But that aside, that's the way our system works. There are 650 seats up for grabs. I will vote for my local MP, and whichever party that person votes for will get a seat in the House of Commons in Parliament. And the party that has the most seats, the majority of seats, will be our ruling party for the next 5 years. Of the 650 seats, the party needs to get 326 seats to have a majority. They will have more than half of the seats in the House of Parliament. If we've got a hung parliament, one party doesn't have an overall majority, and we can have a coalition government. So two parties might come together to get past that 326 number, which is what happened back in 2010. And we had a coalition between the Conservative government and the Liberal Democrats. United Kingdom is one of very few countries with a system like this that doesn't have some form of proportional representation. But what's happened is Labour have a majority, and quite a big majority. They've gained 209 seats. But now looking at these figures, they've got 63% of the seats, so quite a big majority. But of all of the eligible voters in the UK, of everyone who is registered and eligible to vote, 20% of those people voted Labour. And that's the new ruling party. So when we're talking about this being a fair representation of the voting, it doesn't seem like this time it has been. This is a particularly skewed result. I think Labour have got more seats per person that voted for them than ever before in the history of UK politics, which is quite interesting itself and is potentially an argument against first past the post. The Conservative government, the government that was in power for the last 14 years or so, if you count the coalition as well, have got 121 seats, which was a little above what some people were estimating, but they've lost 244 seats. So Labour have gained 209, Conservative have lost 244. That looks to be a pretty straight swap, doesn't it, in terms of seat share. Liberal Democrats have got 72 seats. That's a gain of 61. So a gain between what Labour have gained and Liberal Democrats have gained is about equal to what Conservative have lost. The Greens have got 4 seats, which is one more than previous, which was a good turnout for the Greens. And Reform UK, who are effectively a new party, but it's basically the Brexit party rebadged, gained 5 seats. So they've got 5 seats. They had no seats before. What's worth mentioning is this was the lowest turnout in over 20 years. We've got 59.8% of eligible voters voted. That's a little over half of the people who could vote did vote. There were 59.4% in 2001, so 23 years ago was about par with this. For comparison, the last general election we had in 2019, we saw 67.3% of eligible voters voting, which is almost 10% more than we saw this year. So people weren't going out and voting. Labour had, this time, 9.7 million people voted Labour, which was 33.8% of people who voted. So of the 59.8% of people who got out and voted, 33.8% of those people voted Labour, who are now the party in power, which is not a majority of people. It's only around 33.8% is not much more than a third of people who voted. And this is the party in power, which again is a criticism of first past the post. You usually would see 40 to 50% of voters voting for the party that then comes into power, and that's considered a majority. In 2019, 10.3 million people voted for Labour. Nearly an extra million people voted Labour the last election, and they didn't win. They only got 32% of the vote in 2019. More interestingly than that, in 2015, 12.8 million people voted Labour. They didn't win. So nearly 13 million people voted in 2015 for Jeremy Corbyn, compared with less than 10 million this year. And this year they got in, and previously they didn't. So one might argue, looking at Conservatives' results, so 6.8 million people in the UK voted Conservative, which was 23.7% of people who voted, which is about half of the number of people that voted in 2019 or in terms of percentage, 43.6% voted in 2019, and they got in with a very big 80-seat majority. So what one might say from looking at these stats is that even though 3 million people less voted for Labour than they did in 2015, Labour still won a huge majority. So one might say that this was not a win for the Labour Party, but more a huge loss for the Conservative Party. That would be one way of looking at it. And that's kind of backed up by a YouGov poll that was done on the voting day, asking people what was making them vote the way they were, whether it be specific policies, whether it be something in the manifesto, whether it be their specific MP. 48% of people who were polled said that they were voting to get the Conservative Party out. That was their primary number one consideration. 48% of people who were polled said they were just voting to get the Conservative Party out. So again, looking at the stats, one might say this was not a win for Labour, but simply a massive loss for the Conservative Party. And you can read into that what you want. Which bit of the last 14 years didn't people like? Who knows? But it's not been popular. Green Party got 6.7% of the vote, and they got 4 seats. So 6.7% got 4 seats. Reform UK got 14.3% of the votes. And I remember watching the results coming in, seeing, Reform were in second place, or Reform getting, tens of thousands of votes in these various constituencies, but not getting a seat. Therefore, the results are quite skewed. So Reform UK got 14.3% of the vote and only got 5 seats. So they got well over double the number of people voting for them as the Green Party, but only got 1 more seat. Which again is an interesting reflection on the first past the post system. It's like, if you don't cross that line, you get nothing. In 2011, the UK had a referendum on electoral reform, on whether we wanted to keep the first past the post system. To the best of my knowledge, I think there's only 2 other countries that use the first past the post system. Most of the rest of the modern and democratic world will use some form of proportional representation. I don't know a lot about the way the United States works with their representation. I understand it is very much a 2-party system, whereas over here we do have more parties, although it's harder for them to get a share from what we've just seen. So I'm not going to comment too much on the United States and what they're doing, but I understand most of the modern world have some form of proportional representation where the number of people voting is then reflected in whatever the upper chamber happens to be, or the lower chamber in the UK. So in 2011, we had a referendum on electoral change. And now people like Nigel Farage of the Reform Party and even some Conservatives are starting to talk about wanting to revisit that, because perhaps the first past the post system isn't the best way of going. And maybe we need electoral reform for some sort of proportional representation, which would mean that your vote, or the percentage of people voting for a party, would get that many seats in Parliament, rather than simply just getting past that line. You get a seat, everyone else gets nothing. And looking at this, the Labour government got less than 40% of the votes of people who actually voted, and got 63% of the seats. Well, that's not really proportional. And Conservative got 23.7% of the vote and have got, next to no seats. We're looking at, they've got less than a quarter of seats. The issue you've got when revisiting the idea of a referendum on electoral reform is because we had one in 2011, which wasn't that long ago. It was only 13 years ago. We've also had some other referendums since then. There was a referendum on Scottish independence, where Scotland voted to stay part of the United Kingdom. It was quite close. We also had the Brexit referendum, where the UK voted to leave the EU, and that was incredibly close. That was 55% for and 45% against, so incredibly close. And many people in British politics, particularly someone like Nigel Farage, who campaigned for Brexit, for leaving the EU, was saying, no, this is a once-in-a-lifetime referendum. We cannot revisit this. The people have spoken. Is now someone who's talking about electoral reform and talking about perhaps revisiting that. And I think if Nigel Farage starts talking about having a second referendum on electoral reform and going against what was voted for in 2011, I think he's going to open a can of worms for himself, because if you want to have a second referendum and go back to the people and ask them a question, which I'm not against, I think people do change their minds, and if the situation changes, you should ask them again. But people who have been saying there should be no second referendum on leaving the EU, if they now start saying we should have a second referendum on electoral reform, or even if anyone in Scotland says that they should have a second referendum on Scottish independence, which looks unlikely because the SNP vote has just tanked in favour of Labour in Scotland, so I don't think that's going to be revisited. But certainly, if someone like Farage starts saying we need electoral reform, we need to have a referendum, and we have a second referendum 13 years after the last one, well, at what point should we have another EU referendum, which some people have been asking for? And if he pushes for one, he can't then fight against the other. So I think that's quite interesting politically. I also think the UK media has got a lot to answer for the rise in reform, because looking at the YouGov poll, which said 48% of people wanted the Tories out, that means 48% of people want to change the status quo. They want to change government. And Reform UK have been offering change. Arguably, Labour's manifesto didn't represent a huge change from the status quo. Yeah, there's some things they want to change in there, but we're not talking like seismic shifts and huge changes in policy. It's going to be very much, business as usual with a few tweaks here and there. Also concerning that a lot of the UK media started to get behind Labour, and Labour started to get increased funding. And when Keir Starmer said he was proud that The Sun was supporting him, I didn't see that as a positive, because that is not a widely respected, reputable piece of newspaper. The media are pushing them because they've got the interests of people like Murdoch in mind. And I don't think that Rupert Murdoch and I have similar goals, aspirations, needs, and wants. What's good for people that run media empires is probably not good for someone like me that runs a small business and has a small family and a modest living. So I'll be interested to see what happens over the next few years. I don't think we're going to see any seismic change. I do think that people will still want change in 2029. I'd like to see the media giving more attention to parties like the Greens, who represent just as big a change of the status quo as Reform UK. but didn't really get a huge turnout. 6.7% people voted Green, 14.3% voted Reform, who are effectively a new party. And personally, I don't think that shows masses of support for the policies of Reform UK. But I think when people are talking about wanting change, wanting a change of government, and wanting something to be different or everything to be different, that was who's been thrust in their face by the media. You've got a party with, no real track record at this point, being on every single panel show, every single talk show, reform this, reform that. We gave them a platform. If the media had given the same platform to the Greens, I like to think that they'd have probably seen a similar kind of vote share. And who knows, they might have even got a few more seats out of it. So that's been our week, and that's like quite an in-depth dive into the results of the general election. I'm not unhappy with the results. I think change was needed. We've got a Labour politician in my area. My constituency has changed from Conservative to Labour. Most of the surrounding area is still Conservative in this area. And just for those that aren't familiar with geography and where I am, the next constituency over to me is Nigel Farage's seat, Clacton-on-Sea. So we're right next to that. And he was actually at an event we were at a couple of weeks ago. We might even have to engage with Nigel Farage because we're running a lot of outreach projects in Clacton. And if the local MP has any interest in the feeding of young people from low-income families and activities and intervention to prevent crime in young people, which I hope he would, we might even end up engaging with him. As ever, I like to stay apolitical, which is why I was quite unhappy when a local politician used a photo of me in their brochure before the election. I didn't like that because I don't want people to think I vote one way or think I vote another way. That's kind of my business, which is why ballots are private. People that watch this channel will kind of know what my beliefs are, but in terms of like me telling people to go out and vote, I'm not going to say vote for this party or support that party because I don't feel it's my place. You got to do what you think is right for you by your ethics, your morals, and what you think is right for the country or your family or whatever you need to do. Anyway, that's enough of that. Another interview coming next week and more interviews coming. I might go to a fortnightly upload for the long form over the summer as we are very busy, but I do have a few interviews scheduled. So you guys, thank you so much for all of the love. Thank you so much for all of the comments, all of the likes, all of the views, those over 200 subscribers now. I'm refreshed, back on it, and I'll see you again soon.